Okay, I guess. It's closed. Uh, Shut that down. Share. Share sound. Okie doke. Welcome to that the 8th of March, I think. Later on tonight is after hours, and of not sure what is going to be there in place of Twilight Zone. I think something
We
else by
we
Rod
will
Serling,
have
right?
Twilight Zone in.
Oh, all right.
I found that episode with Carol
Oh,
Burnett.
the Carol Burnett episode. All
Yeah.
righty. So hang in there. I'm just going to yak about other matters. I'm continuing on the idea of faux frais, that is, false costs, which are not the same as other kinds of fictional capital or, fiction or false consciousness. But I'll talk a little bit about each, simply because there's a lot that doesn't get included, and I would assert that even our current politics are being corrupted by certain ideas that are working in the margins. The idea that just because we didn't write laws for them, then we can they can be subverted or exploited by opportunistic folks. So that's kind of what I was been fiddling around with, and I came across today a 50-page article, which, of course, I'm not going to read the whole damn thing. You can read it for yourself, but unless you think that we work in on incredible minutia, or that I'm obsessed with minutia, it's an article on Marx and accounting, um, and it'll be actually more interesting. So anyway, Marx's concept of false consciousness refers to the misrepresentation of social relations by subordinate classes, which can lead to misunderstandings about their economic conditions and exploitation. You can argue, of course, that Trumpists, now that the price of eggs is 3 or 4 times what they're supposed to be, and the gas prices will not go down, that they voted for the wrong person, that the everything that they were trying to blame on Biden is actually Trump's idea. This idea suggests that individuals may not recognize the true nature of their economic situation due to dominant ideologies that obscure the realities of class struggle and labor exploitation. And that's going to come up, and we're going to see regional effects with these employment cuts of one kind or another. And even if they get reversed or beaten back, people will get lost in the margins. A lot of probationary people are being let out there into the job market. So, and woe be to them who decided of those people who have been cut loose. Whether it would be interesting to poll or to survey them to see who voted for Trump. Not that we will laugh at them or anything. Now, false consciousness is not like faux frais, that is, false costs, wherein Marx's social accounting value form issues related to exchange and costs do not consider the range of unpaid labor that remains productive. So, productive unpaid labor, which sits in a lot of different places. Artists could be described as people who do productive labor that is unpaid. And, because, of course, the standard saw is that they're doing it for themselves. It is the ultimate doing art for art's sake. The expression is the pay. I've never heard anyone actually say that, but I think the back of every gallery owner's mind, that's kind of at work. So the point is that it adds to surplus values various circuits. So let me remind you what faux frais of production is. It's a concept used by classical political economists and by Karl Marx in his critique of political economy. The point that our author today is going to talk a little bit about are referred to, is the idea that Marx starts with this idea, with naming the thing that he's going to do, the critique of political economy. But at some moment in the 1860s, he suddenly decides to not refer to it as a critique of political economy so much as he's going to call it capital, das Kapital in big letters. It refers to incidental operating expenses, faux frais does, incurred in the productive investment of capital, which do not themselves add new value to output. In Marx's social accounting, the faux frais, FAUX, FRAIS, are a component of constant capital, or alternately, are funded by a fraction of the new surplus value. So when owners of capital invest in production, they do not invest in labor power, materials, buildings, and equipment, or, as they say, means of production. They must also meet a range of other operating expenses. This is this idea that something else is going on. They are, quote unquote, incidental. And they can include all kinds of things like bookkeeping, training, catering, cleaning and repairs, advertising, insurance, security services, bribes, taxes and levies, etc. It's kind of like Trump's misunderstanding of what tariffs are. Marx has in mind mainly those circulation costs directly necessary and indispensable to keep production going, not fringe benefits. And we're distinguishing between something that is slightly more central and definitely not fringe. And in modern and medium-sized to large-sized businesses, fixed capital assets will, on average, be the largest single component of the annual tangible capital outlay. After that, materials and wages. But depending on the nature of the business, the faux frais might be a considerable portion or proportion of the total capital outlay. In general, Marx seems to have regarded net insurance and tax payments from gross production income as part of surplus value. But he never elaborated on this point in detail. Presumably, it depends on the nature of the tax and insurance claims themselves. And of course, you can see that the idea of tax and insurance claims are a product of an activity that involves a lot of financialization. So there's other things at work here. And so in my quest to try and straighten this out, I discovered a guy who, uh, I he only just recently retired from the University of Warwick, and uh, but he was an accounting professor and a Marxist accounting professor in the business school, not in the economics department. Also quite amusing to me, just for that very reason. And in fact, he has a fairly new book. I think it came out in 23 um, on accounting and the recent crisis. It describes the history of American, crisis accounting, or the crises and accounting, from somewhere around um, the Great Depression to the Great Recession, which is probably the most vital time to be thinking about American capital accumulation. So anyway, R.A. Breyer, I think it's Rob Breyer, University of Warwick. Marx's accounting solution to the transformation problem. This is an article from a little while back. Um, so it's not as current, but it actually is included in. You can sort of see, and I'll show a link to his latest book. Before Foley and Dumanil's new interpretation, we've talked about this before, the idea that in the sort of post-war transition from trying to figure out whether there's an orthodox Marxism or a new reading of Marx, particularly the German new reading. In economics, there is, or at least in Marxist economics, there's a kind of new interpretation movement that asks value questions. Most economists concluded that Marx had failed to solve the transformation problem before the new interpretation in Capital. But that solving it rigorously showed his labor theory of value was incoherent, and there's a variety of literature that declares that to be the definitive point of view. And as we've noted, that it's largely more indeterminate, and it depends really how you apply it. It is a much larger paradigmatic question, probably more dependent on commensurate or incommensurable elements. But anyway, the new interpretation allows a rigorous solution to the problem that is consistent with Marx's core claim that only socially necessary labor time adds money value to commodities. But the new interpretation is inconsistent with some of Marx's claims and remains controversial. However, the paper argues that there is no transformation problem in capital to solve in the way economists pose it. That is, of transforming socially necessary labor time into prices of production to give all capitalists the general rate of profit. But an accounting transformation that he did solve rigorously, that's Breyer's point. It argues that Marx theorized capitalist accounting to solve the reverse of the economist's problem. That is, how capitalists transform the general rate of profit and prices of production into socially necessary labor time, eventually working out that capitalist accounts measure capital as the money value of socially necessary labor time, which is equal for identical use values. Now, that's still controversial, but it's an interesting proposition to try and make at least some connection, um, talking about labor time as a function of labor power, not so much labor itself, right? That it is an abstraction. So you need to sort of retain that in your head, that it's not exactly about time motion studies. It's more about the conceptual element of certain things are being extracted, and you may not actually know when it's happening. Marx concluded that the history of capitalism had solved the transformation problem by requiring individual capitalists to take control of the valorization process and pursue cost price, cost price, what accountants today call standard or target costs. It is about terminology on the one hand, and in fact, even I think Samuelson even talks about it as it's not as problematic, but it's difficult because some people are just, and you say the four-letter word Marx and everybody, goes nuts. The real thing is to look at to adumbrate around actual terms, and that's what so many of the British Marxists, particularly those who have actually worked in the city, that is, worked in finance, actually are sort of, I mean, none of them really liked it because no one wants to work for the man, etc. But it is important to understand your relationship to money bags, so to speak. The paper argues that this discovery, that is, cost price or standard or target costs, argues that the discovery explains Marx's decisions at the end of 1862 to change the title of his project to Capital and to begin assuming that the price of a commodity equals the money value of the socially necessary labor time to produce it. Seems pretty simple that if you structure everything around a certain abstraction called a commodity, and you try to work out how it has a certain form, and when you find something that's slightly more abstract or more universal, like money, to sort of as a commodity, to kind of um, create an identity or an equivalence, all of these things sort of fit together, and you can sort of see how you yourself, the laborer, sort of fit in the whole process. It analyzes the new interpretation's advance and its accounting limitations and challenges its conclusion that we cannot use Marx's theory of value to explain the prices of commodities and the profits of individual capitalist firms. So we're looking at two different levels, at a macro level and at a micro level. It explains Marx's accounting solution to the transformation from prices to values, and concludes that capitalist accounts support this claim, highlighted but not substantiated by the new interpretation that the sum of all of profits of individual enterprises is society's total surplus value. That an individual enterprise's profit is a fragment of society's surplus value. It uses Marx's theory of accounting to solve the apparently incorrigible problem of allocating joint costs, including fixed capital. The paper concludes that capital provides an integrated accounting theory of how capitalists collectively control individual enterprises to produce, circulate, and simultaneously distribute surplus value from the exploitation of labor so that every capitalist gets an equal return on capital. It calls on critical, this is the tagline, it calls on critical accountants to take Marx seriously because, Ryer's an accounting professor, and on Marxists to take accounting seriously as Marx did. So that's kind of the whole point of his exercise. I think he repeats this elsewhere, which is, and I've mentioned this before, as I've said, accounting rules did change in America at a certain shifts in time. It changed during the Depression for a variety of reasons, and partially because, Smoot-Hawley and all that stuff that screwed up the U.S. economy sort of necessitated a lot of different ways of thinking about capital. The fact is, stuff had to happen because it got pretty ugly in the 20s in general. And then you added all of this other stuff, the post-World War I stuff, reparations, whatever, that destabilized the global economy. Anyway, I'll read the introduction and then I'll skip about 30 or 40 pages and get to the conclusion. There's a little math, not too much in this article. It's really more of an article about the kind of history of thinking about accounting and to show that Marx wasn't just hanging out with Engels. He was actually, he would go up to the mill and kind of try and figure stuff out. That he'd do a little research. He did his own research, but as I've said before, the counterfactual could be, if Marx got a gig at the University of Manchester, the world would be different. Anyway, the nonsense about the necessity of proving the concept of value arises from the complete ignorance both of the subject dealt with and of the method of science. This is Marx, 1868, a letter to Kugelmann. Marx claimed his work in Capital had dealt a theoretical blow to the bourgeoisie from which they will never recover. Today, many economists, including some Marxist economists, think his labor theory of value is incoherent. Most Marxists argue defensively that Marx did not try to explain prices and rates of profit, but propounded only a qualitative theory of capitalist exploitation. Only a beleaguered and dwindling minority cling to its intuitive appeal and continue searching for a proof that Marx's theory has the rigor and generality that he claimed. The paper supports the minority, but argues that only by understanding accounting can Marxists overcome dual entry bookkeeping. Can Marxists overcome the apparently formidable problem of finding an interpretation and reconstruction of the labor theory of value, which is simultaneously an unimpeachable representation of Marx's own views and a foundation for a progressive economic research program. It's a modest idea, but kind of important. And those who attended those first sessions of the Class Unity course on the Great Recession, recession, will remember that began with some commentary on that everyone should study double entry bookkeeping. Some economists have noted an affinity between the labor theory of value and accounting. This includes Sweezy, Hicks, Foley, Clomer, and McCloskey, Dutra, but have not pursued the matter. Sweezy, for example, Paul Sweezy, for example, said Marx's value theory has the great merit, unlike some other value theories, of close correspondence to the actual accounting categories of capitalistic business enterprise. but apparently thought these too obvious to state or discuss. Others simply believe that profits as evidence of exploitation is clear to all who care to see. That's been fine. The paper argues that the key to understanding Marx's labor theory of value is to recognize that accounting underlies capital's explanation of how capitalism controls the production, circulation, and simultaneous distribution of surplus value. It shows that to work out his explanation, Marx theorized why and how capitalists keep their accounts the way they do. Grounding his theory in accounting would explain why Marx dismissed the criticism that he had not proved the concept of value. This is his assertion that even if there were no chapter on value in my book, the analysis of the real relationships which I give would contain the proof and demonstration of the real value relation. This is from another letter to Kugelmann, 1868. As throughout Capital, Marx uses accounting categories of capital, profit, and costs, etc., and real capitalist accounts to explain real relationships between capitalists and workers. The paper agrees with Marx that he had no need to prove his theory of value. Now, that alone is problematic for some folks. But we will persist until the appearance of the new interpretation, that is NI, by Dumenil and Foley in the 1980s. A long line of economists had concluded that no rigorous solution existed for Marx's transformation problem that remained consistent with the central claims of his labor theory of value. But the new interpretation is controversial. Many still think that capital contains an unresolved logical contradiction etched into the structure of its presentation. In volumes 1 and 2, we're reading volume 1 now, Marx assumes that the market prices of all commodities equals the monetary value of the socially necessary labor time required to make them. Yet from part 2 of volume 3, he accepts that in reality, competition means that prices equal the cost of production plus the general rate of profit. Now, most economists, including supporters of the new interpretation, conclude that Marx failed to give a fully rigorous solution to the transformation problem, how the economy transforms socially necessary labor time into prices of production, the long-run market prices that give all capitalists the risk-adjusted general rate of profit. The paper argues that this framing of the problem stands Marx on his head, that the problem Marx solved in volume 3 was how capitalists collectively transform the general rate of profit and prices of production into socially necessary labor time in production, which solves the transformation problem by requiring individual capitalists to take control of the valorization process and not the other way around. And this is important because in some ways this kind of what, without getting too ugly about it, you could argue that venture capitalists kind of operate in this kind of funny way, but that gets ahead of the argument. This would explain why Marx, who is not averse to mathematics, did not attempt to solve the economist's transformation problem in volume 3 and justifies apparent dismissal of the issue. Our present analysis does not necessitate a closer examination of this point. That may actually be Engels editing that out. A fully rigorous solution Foley and Dumenil interpretation of the transformation problem at the aggregate level of the economy is consistent with the central claim of Marx's theory of value, that only socially necessary labor time adds money value to commodities in production. However, they conclude that Marx located the labor theory of value at the level of the aggregate production of commodities, not, as Ricardo expressed it, in each particular commodity. So he's already working at scale here, and this is the complication of Marx. Is to sometimes he talks in terms of big things, and sometimes about little things, and so you have to sort of plow through that. And also because it's all these manuscripts all put together and re-edited, etc., and often it's an editing problem. According to the new interpretation, Marx gave us only an aggregate theory asserting that the labor time worked by productive labor is the source of all money value added, whatever prices happen to be. Now, that's kind of reductive. It follows that we cannot use Marx's theory to explain the prices of individual commodities and the profits of individual capitalist firms. The paper argues that we can by using Marx's theory of capitalist accounting. It shows that, consistent with the new interpretation's treatment of variable capital, that is, expenditure on productive wages, right? Accounting for the money value of socially necessary labor time is the key principle underlying capitalist accounting that Marx, with help from Engels, identified. This correspondence, the paper argues, is evidence that profit is, as Marx says it is, a form or fragment of surplus value, and supports his claim that the sum of individual profits equals society's total surplus value. And so this little set of relations does have continuity. It's even numerical in that sense. Marx spends far too much time trying to do the arithmetic, and and in fact assumes it away by the time we move several volumes forward. Um, but it's pretty consistent. It's not as incoherent as some people might claim. And the incoherence, I will argue, I'm just taking advantage of this little break here. The reason why that is of course, as I've said before, volume one was kind of front loaded in terms of trying to summarize what the conclusions of volumes two and three into volume one. So it's kind of, he's trying to get the whole thing to sort of be summarized in volume one, so you didn't necessarily have to get on to volume two and three. Well, and by the time he died, it's just, this is a different it became a different project. Anyway, back to Breyer. Part one presents evidence that Marx drew on Engels' knowledge of accounting to work out his labor theory of value and theory of capitalist control. It argues that a breakthrough in Marx's theorizing of accounting for fixed capital explained his decisions in December 1862 to change the title of his project to Capital, and to start it with an analysis of the commodity, assuming that the money value of socially necessary labor time required to produce it equaled its long-run market price. This is the crux of the problem. Part two argues that Marx's method of presenting capital followed from his theory of capitalist accounts. Volumes one and two analyze capital in general, the circuits of capital at the level of the capitalist firm as a representative of all capitals combined. Volume 1 analyzes how the capitalist firm accounts for the production of surplus value. Volume 2 analyzes how it accounts for the production and circulation of value, that is, its sales, and shows how they're part of the same integrated circuit, that production equals circulation. This is Department 1 and Department 2, right? Volume 3 analyzes the accounts of total social capital, the consolidated accounts of capitalists collectively, and how competition between individual enterprises, whether they're subsidiaries or branches, seeking the general rate of profit, ensures that they all produce and circulate surplus value so that every enterprise gets an equal return for equal capital. That is, Volume 3 shows that the production and circulation of surplus value simultaneously distributes it so that individual firms earn an equal return on capital. Part 3 provides an accounting critique of the new interpretation and argues that, while it is an advance on previous interpretations, it gives only a partial accounting solution. Part 4 gives Marx's accounting solution and supports his claim that in Volume 3, he had shown that labor remained the source of all value in the real world of competitive capitalism when prices diverged from values. The two critical aspects of this claim overlooked by economists are that his solution to the transformation problem is historical and that relies on capitalist accounting. It presupposes the really difficult history of total social capital That is, capitalists functioning as a living collective, demanding the general rate of profit, and competing individual capitalists using accounts to control their labor processes to transform prices of production into socially necessary labor times, which they account for at what accountants today call standard or target costs. So it's all about a set of expectations about what is it that we want, how is it that we're going to get it, that we need to plan for it. You need to, you know, need to set up accounting categories for present value versus future, whatever. Anyway, all that kind of stuff, including depreciation, amortization, blah, 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 blah. History created the general rate of profit and total social capital, which now requires individual capitalists to make the transformation from market prices to values rather than, as usually understood, to make the transition from values to prices. That's probably the key point, or at least a kind of heuristic or a conceptual kind of way in which to assume how this moves forward. Part 4 concludes that Marx gives a general, quantitative solution to the transformation from prices to values of capitalists keeping socially necessary labor time accounts in money, according to the law of one cost, whereby individual commodities absorb equal amounts of the money value of socially necessary labor time. Marx's core claim, highlighted by the new interpretation. It concludes by using Marx's theory of accounting to solve the apparently incorrigible problems of accounting for production overheads, fixed capital, and joint costs to illustrate how capitalists account for the cost of production as the money value of socially necessary labor time as target costs. The paper concludes that in Capital, Marx explained his theory of capitalist control, which is the key word there, capitalist control, using a labor theory of value derived from capitalist accounts, and that there is therefore no transformation problem. More generally, it concludes that understanding the role of accounting in capital integrates Marx's analysis of capitalist society and the capitalist firm and promises to deal theoretically and empirically with other spurious problems invented by economists, such as the distinction, as I just mentioned, between productive and unproductive labor. It calls on Marxists to take, as the tagline here, calls on Marxists to take accounting seriously and on critical accountants to take Marx seriously, which is like probably what Breyer says at the end of every class he teaches. Anyway, I won't, belabor you, but what Breyer does is, for example, he puts Quenet's tableau économique in dual entry bookkeeping to make it more coherent. So that happens. So there's a lot of, you know, does it not? How does it fit into, operating costs and stuff like that? And he has shown in other papers that Marx understood capitalist depreciation accounting, whereas part 3 in parts 3 and 4 in Capital, and this is in volume 3, I think, shows that Marxist economists do not. Anyway, so yes, it goes on, and there's all kinds of other stuff. And so I'm going to skip down, as I usually do. There's a section where it shows that Marx just accepts a kind of convention that you can a kind of accumulate or collect costs into kind of single amounts, so that there's a quote unquote law of one cost at work, which is not inconsistent with other ways of approaching the problem, and that it actually does fit in some ideas of accounting. Anyway, not that I'm a scholar in that at all. So, concluding comments: to rescue Marx's labor theory of value from Marxist economists, we must not understand him as simply an economist, even a political economist, and not even as this plus a historian, philosopher, and sociologist. He was all of these. But to understand the generality, rigor, and relevance of his theory, we must see Marx as a theorizer of the business reality he confronted in the 19th century, particularly its preoccupation with accounts. Breyer's written a whole bunch of stuff on accounting, the history of accounting, and understand that he theorized capitalism by first theorizing capitalist accounting. Although the new interpretation is an advance on the neo-Ricardian approach, that's the difference between let's see, Steedman. You go Ricardo, Sraffa, Steedman, sort of, and then you have all this neo-Ricardian stuff, and then you have the new interpretation, which tries to um, sort of disentangle the from all of the Ricardian stuff. Anyway, it fails, although the new interpretation is an advance on the neo-Ricardian approach, it fails to deal consistently with constant capital, a limitation imposed by its commitment to modeling physical production systems. That's Fred Mosley's position, rather than modeling social control systems. And that's a kind of fundamental thing that requires, I would say, particularly in an age of so-called new institutional theory, where you're talking about transactions more, that that's kind of the core of the argument, and still remains the core of the argument relative to the failure of financialization, et cetera. To understand Marx's theory of capitalist control and his solution to the transformation problem, Marxists must understand his history and his theory of accounting. Only then can they follow him into production, out to the market, and to total social capital and back over the tough intellectual terrains that he takes us in Capital, and fully appreciate the views. Marx's accounting solution to the transformation problem is that because the market price of all identical commodities is equal, for the labor theory of value to work, the same must be true of its components, socially demanded profit and socially necessary cost. Marx certainly asserted that what was equal between commodities was the money value of the socially necessary labor time they contained. However, as this principle underlies capitalist accounting practices, scholars need look no further for a rich source of evidence in support of his labor theory of value, and Marx had no need to provide any more. Understanding the importance of accounting in Marx's theory could help to resolve other apparent weaknesses in his theory, particularly the controversies surrounding the primacy of the material or social, which Breyer has looked at before, and the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, which I referred to before as well. It could also form the foundation of a critical social and economic research program with radical intent that would demonstrate what Marxists often take as self-evident, that profit is evidence of exploitation. That's a big deal. I mean, it's what they tripped Romer up on, John Romer up on, for example. Accounting is conspicuous by its absence in the discussion and empirical research of Marxist scholars, yet it holds out the prospect of clarifying and articulating Marx's theory of capitalist control in modern conditions, and the promise that understanding will help to construct the radical critiques necessary to abolish it. And as I said, there's a tagline: it is time critical accountants took Marx seriously, and that Marxists took accounting seriously, just as Marx did. So, um, I, it's nice that he has a tagline, a kind of a superhero deal. Um, it is, I think, important to understand the differences among these ideas, and that, of course, let a thousand or 100 theories bloom. The point being, of course, that there's let me go to couple footnotes because those are important. I think they're important. There are several good reasons why Marx did not highlight accounting, particularly as we shall see here, that he thought it was too obvious to need stressing, and he wanted to get beneath its inchoate categories. Footnote 2, in volumes 1 and 2, Marx defined socially necessary labor time to mean the labor time required to produce an article under normal conditions of production, and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. Now, he's trying to regularize and those who know linear programming, this is kind of what you want to try to seek and try to get this to kind of even out. Part three argues that in volume one, Marx modified the definition because he concluded that under competition, capitalists imposed an overriding definition of socially necessary labor time to mean that implied by cost price, what accountants today call standard or target costs, the maximum cost of production that allows the capitalist to earn the general rate of profit. So it's all about measurement issues. And that this is difficult when you don't have a lot of reliable data, which is why Marx goes through all this math, or arithmetic anyway, to try and convince you that it's not that complicated. Until then, references to socially necessary labor time are, to Marx's general definition, references to the individual capitalist firm, or the capitalist, are to joint stock companies with managers and many shareholders who own diversified portfolios. Remember that this is, the early corporate structure and you have to think about, who are you maximizing profit for? Are you maximizing it for the company or for the shareholders? Or, it's that whole thing about shareholder value, right? And then he quotes himself on his 1994 paper, noted the correspondence between Marx and Engels on the topic of depreciation, because he mentioned here before that he understood depreciation, which I had thought he didn't, but I think he didn't. I now know that he does. Chiapello analyzes some of this and other correspondence on accounting. This paper extends the range of accounting topics and goes into the details and their significance for Marx's project and capital. Okay, so I hope this makes a little sense to you. I've used up the time that I've planned. There's other commentary in here that's really interesting and important. People that I know, the late Michael Perelman, et cetera, have a very different view of some of this. And this is why it's controversial. On the end, in fact, Breiter is probably controversial because somewhere in this text, he talks about that he has a preference for a particular value position that for some people would say that because he agrees with Kleiman's sort of single system analysis, then that he's oversimplified the argument, and that's that it corrupts his conclusion. I don't think it does. I think what he's trying to do empirically, and I think as a historian, uh, in the sense that he's sort of tracked down the very specific areas and does a good analysis, I think, without having to go through a lot of math. Although he does have a mathematical appendix for this article, that I'm not foisting on you, that you can show that Marx was quite aware of these analytical matters, and we know that he had analytical interests anyway, because he had to sort of figure out other stuff, like geology and like biology and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like he didn't know what he was doing, and he had extensive notes on calculus, et cetera. So whether he fully appreciated it, and as I've said before, his in a counterfactual, we could say, well, if he was really aware of all this other marginal analysis going on, he might have been better served. But I think he arrives at the same solution without that much fanfare, and we shouldn't accuse him of being far too flippant about accounting matters. So it may be a little self-serving, I suppose, for a accounting scholar to stick his nose in. But you can see from his own text, he did an article in '93 on double entry bookkeeping and the birth of capitalism, as I have mentioned before about Italian banks, accounting for the commercial revolution in northern Italy. So you can just see you can actually get there from here. It's 1994, why Marx's labor theory is superior to the marginalist theory of value, the case from modern financial reporting. So that, and these are written within the accounting community. So this is actually quite fascinating. Um, Even though other people will go, accountants, God. But I do think that this fellow Breyer, who is just retired, I think he's emeritus at Warwick, does for that. And of course, his new book, and I will pimp his new book or slightly new book, 2023, Frontiers of Accounting and Financial History, Volume 2, Accounting for Crises, a Marxist History of American Accounting Theory. Now, that may sound really tedious on the one hand. I would assert, though, and I'd love to hear Michael Hudson read this thing and maybe comment on it. That would be, for me, really cool. Um, just because I think that, I just like to get it, because he does do because Hudson does do a critique of Irving Fisher, and I think the definitive work on, the why we even mention Irving Fisher should be still done. I've included a link here to a sample chapter, which is uh, chapter one of the book, and it's only 15 pages. And if you're really excited about accounting theory and crises, you might want to read that. And then I tacked on the end that it's not all nonsense. It's just that the language needs to be sort of sorted out. And I suppose sort of AI translation should be done to, in fact, this is a job for AI, is to go through the text and just, reconvert marks so it just looks like standard business jargon, um, because it has lots of little nuances that come with how you talk about costs, for example, operating expenses, et cetera. And all of those things are categorical and interesting from a cultural point of view, interesting because rent is a big deal, interesting because, interest bearing stuff is, of course, as we see now, in the current problem that Trump has presented us with, and that is to delimit or erase federal non-capitalized research and development funds. It just, you know, I mean, the obvious thing is the reason why they're doing it is to try to privatize everything, is to try and force everyone to go get jobs, maybe in the private sector, or at least get them out of the federal government, because that's kind of what they're trying to do, and make money while they're doing it. And then I have a little thing in here on land accounting. So anyway, that's all of my little yammering for Friday. Our programming had hoped for a reunion of the professors, but I think that's going to be held on next week. We had a scheduling issue. Um, Remember the Python guys had chartered accountant, chartered accountant stuff. So this is not wholly irrelevant. Chartered accountancy. Anyway, yes, no, remember I didn't put a lot of math there. So anyway, accountancy, the final frontier. It's not to make everyone into accountants. People who go to business school do have to take basic accounting and then cost accounting. So whatever. All right. So I'm going to stop the share because I've used up all my time, and stop now the live stream. And thank you very much for your attention. And I hope this of some interest. I would assert that most people don't think about those accounting things when they're talking about, settler colonialism, exploitation, um, you know, intersectional subjugation, racism, gender divisions, and all of that stuff. It's still, without getting into a final,